Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Welcome back to another edition of Michael Brown Unplugged. Glad to have you with me. Let's get started because I got a lot of stuff to cover today. The Senate last week confirmed the 39th Circuit Court judge under President Trump. Judge Michael Park's going to join 5 other Republican-appointed active judges on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. The Washington Times reports that Trump flipped the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals earlier this year, taking it from a 7-4 Democratic edge in judicial appointees back in 2017 to a 7-6 Republican edge among active judges. Now, let me explain active judges. A lot of federal judges, after serving, a period of time, or they get to a certain age, they'll take senior status. They're still federal judges, and they still occasionally get assigned to cases. But these senior federal judges they're not that active. They're not in the usual rotation, so that when someone walks into the federal court clerk's office, files a lawsuit, it doesn't get assigned to them. It gets assigned to the active judges. But the point that I think that we're missing in all of the minutia and all of the, well, not just the minutia, but in the grand scheme of things too. So in the little bitty things and in the great big things, I think one of the things that we're missing is how Donald Trump is confirming, and we got to give Mitch McConnell credit too, the United States Senate and Donald Trump acting together are confirming judges at a record pace. And what does that mean? Well, we'll get to that in a second. Trump is actually on a record pace that is transforming the judicial landscape, because prior to taking office, Democrat-appointed judges held a 90-71 advantage over Republican-appointed ones all across all of the circuits. Now that advantage has been reversed, with the number of Republican-appointed judges outnumbering Democrat appointments by a margin of 90-83. Now, that may not seem like a lot, 7. But when you flip these circuit courts, when you change the judicial philosophy of the courts, when you are able to go from activist judges to judges who simply want to apply the Constitution to laws and regulations, to be textualists, to be constitutionalists, to be judges in the nature of Justice Scalia, you are fundamentally transforming the judiciary. And I think this fundamental transformation is the kind that will get us back to what that third branch of government, the judiciary, should be doing. And that is deciding the constitutionality of laws. Now, I have noted over the years that, over the past 2 years to be precise, how Democrats have done everything they can to obstruct and slow down the confirmation process of judicial nominees. So let's give some credit where credit's due. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell finally had enough of the Democrat delay tactics, and he has instigated the so-called nuclear option a second time, changing the rules to lower the threshold for overcoming a filibuster. Following the Senate's 54-42 confirmation of Judge Joseph Bianco to the Second Circuit earlier this week, McConnell explained the reason why he initiated that particular rule change. He pointed out that Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who had just voted against Judge Bianco, was singing an entirely different tune 13 years ago when he said that American Bar Associated appointed judges that were outstandingly qualified and well-respected should be confirmed. Well, Judge Bianco is precisely that. He is a judicial nominee that the ABA, even though the Senate has said that they will really no longer pay any attention to what the ABA's recommendation is, you know that most senators are still looking at it. And in this case, even though Schumer has said that a judge must have the outstandingly qualified and well-respected approval of the ABA. In this case, the judge had it, and Schumer still voted against him. The other thing I'd like for everyone to understand is that the delay tactics that the Senate was using, those tactics were designed to put off approval of judicial nominees, hopefully until the 2020 election. Because if they could just get to November of 2020, then they can apply the rule, which I think is a fair rule, that any nominees pending at that time or any nominees that come up after a new president has been elected but not yet been inaugurated, those judicial nominees should not be considered by the Senate. The implications of President Trump being able to fundamentally transform the judiciary, and I just love using that phrase because we know that Barack Obama wanted to fundamentally transform America, but he wanted to fundamentally transform us into some sort of democratic socialist nation. Well, what President Trump is doing here is fundamentally transforming the judicial branch, the third branch of the federal government, back to its original meaning, with judges who look to the original meaning of the Constitution. And I think that's the kind of fundamental transformation that we can all agree is actually something good for us. Let me get a sip of Diet Coke and move on to the next topic. I wanted to talk about, speaking of Donald Trump's election victory in 2016, what it meant for the country. Now, I've not gotten into the whole tariff and trade war thing because I kind of want to see how it plays out a little bit first. So set that aside. But perhaps wary of Donald Trump's 2016 victory, a lot of international reporters at the New York Times are seeing the so-called far right everywhere in unlikely guises, such as supporting being allowed to eat and drink whatever one likes without government interference. I mean, what a concept, right? The paper filed this really bizarre update from Finland back in April. The headline was, Finland's right appeals to voters with a nihilistic view on climate. Now, the New York Times condescended to conservative voters while reviling the climate stands of conservative politicians. Let me say that again. The New York Times condescended to conservative voters while at the same time reviling the climate stands of conservative politicians. They wrote, when they really wanted to rile up conservative voters this spring, the politicians from Finland's Nationalist Party made a beeline for the rawest subject in this year's general election. No, not immigration, climate. Pause for a moment. Can you imagine? Now, I've seen polls, and I'm not sure where exactly it stands right now, but climate and climate change, when you look at a list of concerns that voters have, it's always near the bottom. But not in Finland. The New York Times goes on to say, as Finland's other parties competed with each other to offer ambitious climate goals ahead of Sunday's general election, the Finns party has seized on climate as a new front in the culture wars, warning its conservative working-class supporters that they are being betrayed by urban elites. Another pause. They've seized on climate as a new front in the culture wars? So it's a cultural war? It's not a scientific battle. It's not a battle about the future of the country. It's about the culture. It's amazing where you can find nuggets of truth if you just look at sometimes what the opposition says or writes. The Times continues, aggressive environmental measures will, quote, take the sausage from the mouths of laborers, warned a Finns party politician, Matti Patukin, in a recent televised debate. And more important, from dogs and cats whose food, he said, would increase in price by 20 to 40%. Now, if that wasn't enough, he suggested contemptuously that if the liberals got their way, dogs and cats would have to accept vegan substitutes for meat. But, this is what's so funny. The paper's own reporting shows the truth behind those political claims. They write, These days, it seems, one of the biggest put-downs of all is to call someone a do-gooder. And on the lips of Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Anti-Immigrant League Party and Italy's most powerful politician, the word buonista, or do-gooder, is a dangerous weapon. The European dream is being buried by the bureaucrats, the do-gooders and the bankers who are governing Europe for too much time, Mr. Salvini said this past week at the introduction of a new alliance of far-right and populist parties before the European parliamentary elections in May. Just to insert a footnote here, you may recall, if you listen to all of the podcasts, I described exactly what Mr. Salvini was doing last week, but the Times continues. Do-gooder owes its heavy rotation on Italy's poisonous social media accounts, in political interviews, and in Mr. Salvini's speeches to a period of acute polarization and incivility. But, they write, there are real-world consequences to making good and bad good, not least a more permissive atmosphere to be downright mean, uncivil, or even violent. Seriously? There are real-world consequences to making good bad and bad good, not least a more permissive atmosphere to be downright mean, uncivil, or even violent. Well, who's enacting that kind of Orwellian language? Who's enacting that kind of Orwellian mentality? Yeah, the far left. The most recent example of hysteria was a report on Saturday by Palko Karaz. Norway's health minister rejects being, quote, the moral police. It was a most unusual message from a health official. People should be allowed to eat, drink, and smoke as they see fit. Norway's new minister in charge of public health said this week that adults did not need government lectures about what to put in their bodies. But it sounded a bit like she was telling people to go ahead and indulge. Critics protested her remarks that they were damaging, particularly coming from someone in her position. You know, actually, her remarks were indeed refreshingly libertarian. Listen closely. I think that people should be allowed to smoke, drink, and eat as much red meat as they like, according to Sylvia Listhaug, the government's minister for the elderly and public health, who said in an interview posted on Monday on the website of NRK, Norway's state broadcaster. The government may provide information, but I think people in general know what is healthy and what is not. But the New York Times found those words ominous and dangerous. The interview was published just 3 days after she took over the ministry, and it was dotted with the kind of sharp, controversial comments that Ms. Listhaug, deputy director of the right-wing anti-immigrant Progressive Party, is known for. Now, Karaz quickly linked the freedom to smoke and drink and eat to a murderous fascist terrorist. Yeah, let me say that again. This person, the reporter, quickly linked the idea of having the freedom to smoke and drink and to eat to a murderous fascist terrorist. Listen closely. The Progress Party has been a junior party in Norway's center-right governing coalition since 2013. Its rise to prominence created unease, coming just 2 years after a far-right anti-Muslim extremist who had once belonged to the party killed 77 people in a murderous rampage. Now, this reporter showed absolutely no qualms about government-style food police, describing the policies in really benign terms. Writing, you know, governments around the world have stepped up campaigns to fight unhealthy habits. France recently told people not to drink every day. A soda tax in Britain has helped lower sugar levels in some drinks. And then, of course, the reporter had to stamp an unflattering label on the live and let live philosophy by writing, Ms. Listhaug said that people who smoked felt like pariahs in Norway, and that she would not be the moral police in government. She echoed comments made by Austria's far right defending freedom of choice in opposing anti-smoking legislation. So the bottom line, the New York Times actually does see fascism in Europe, nihilism, meanness in opposing food cops. Imagine a health minister, imagine the Surgeon General coming out and saying, yeah, I think smoking's bad. And I think eating too many cheeseburgers is bad. And I think, excuse me for a second, while I take a sip of Diet Coke, that consuming too much Diet Coke is unhealthy. But I believe, as Surgeon General, that people ought to be able to make those choices. And that government, if they want to provide the information about healthy or unhealthy habits, have at it. But people, individuals, should be able to make the choice about what they consume. I've always found it fascinating how people who are so adamant to respect a woman's or to acknowledge a woman's right to an abortion. Yeah, I'm going to compare abortion to eating here, because they say that the woman has a right to do to her body, having an abortion or not having an abortion, that is her choice. Now, if you can make that a choice, and if that is a legitimate choice, and I'm not arguing one way or another whether it is right now, I'm making a larger point. If a woman can have that choice about whether to have an abortion, if I put it in any other terms, it won't be objective. If a woman has the right to make that decision about her body, then why is it that we're going to, when someone says, yeah, eating too much stuff that's bad for you is bad for you, but you ought to be able to make that choice, why does the New York Times feel compelled to make that a comparison to fascism, to Nazism, to terrorism? I'll tell you why. Because the people that are making those statements are actually libertarian. They may be far right, but the philosophy is libertarian. There seems to be this panicked reaction to claims about Joe Biden, the former vice president. There seems to be this panicked reaction to these claims of family conflicts when he was the vice president. And the reaction seems to me to suggest that Democrats and the media are actually worried about these allegations. And the allegations are about ties that he and his son had, talk about collusion, that he and his son had to Ukraine and to China. You may recall that Biden recently said that China really isn't an enemy of the United States and we really have nothing to fear from China. I mean, you talk about a gaffe. But let's be honest. Let me be honest. I really haven't followed closely the saga of Joe Biden's alleged family conflicts in Ukraine and China when he was vice president. But I am aware that claims and counterclaims have been percolating through the mainstream and the non-mainstream media, and particularly in the Democratic primary field. Now, being in the position of just hearing about it and seeing reactions, I am, honestly, a typical news consumer. I really haven't dug much into it until now. But what I'm sensing, and what I've sensed for some time, is that Ukraine may be to Biden's campaign what emails were to Hillary Clinton's campaign. And China could be in there too. On Ukraine, and here's why I'm beginning to pay more attention to it. The New York Times wrote a story with this headline: Biden faces conflict of interest questions that are being promoted by Trump and allies. Wait a minute. In the headline? You have to learn a headline, how to read a headline. Biden faces conflict of interest questions. Period. That's all you really needed to say. But that are being promoted by Trump and allies? You know, I've read a little bit about these conflicts of interest. I've read a little bit about this collusion between Biden and Ukraine and Biden and China, not just on conservative websites, but I'm reading about it in the New York Times. Now, think about the headline. They say that these conflicts of interest are being promoted by Trump and his allies. But here's what the story actually says. It was a foreign policy role that Joseph R. Biden Jr. enthusiastically embraced during his vice presidency, browbeating Ukraine's notoriously corrupt government to clean up its act. And one of his most memorable performances came on a trip to Kiev in March of 2016 when he threatened to withhold $1 billion in United States loan guarantees if Ukraine's leaders did not dismiss the country's top prosecutor, who had been accused of turning a blind eye to corruption in his own office and among the political elite in Ukraine. The pressure campaign worked, writes the New York Times. The prosecutor general, long a target of criticism from other Western nations and international leaders, was soon voted out by the Ukrainian parliament. The Times continues. Among those who had a stake in the outcome was Hunter Biden, Mr. Biden's younger son, who at the time was on the board of an energy company owned by a Ukrainian oligarch who had been in the sights of the fired prosecutor general. Hunter Biden, the Times writes, was a Yale-educated lawyer who had served on the boards of Amtrak and a number of nonprofit organizations and think tanks, but lacked any experience in Ukraine, and just months earlier had been discharged from the Navy Reserve after testing positive for cocaine. He would be paid as much as $50,000 per month in some months for his work for the company, Burisma Holdings. Now, I don't know. Maybe it's something. Maybe it's nothing. But it is becoming something that people are talking about, including Senator Rand Paul. Sunday on ABC's This Week, Senator Rand Paul discussed reports that former Vice President Joe Biden faces questions of conflict of interest related to his son's business interests in Ukraine. This week, the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, floated and eventually scrapped a plan to travel to Ukraine to ask for an investigation. Senator Paul told ABC that most Americans will be dismayed that the vice president's son was doing this while Joe Biden was actually lobbying to have this company, go free of prosecution. Now, the Giuliani, I wish Giuliani would just be quiet. But the Rudy trip generated its own fumes, with Democrat candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Robert O'Rourke jumping into Biden's defense, as Salon reports. Salon wrote that, I just think it is highly unethical for the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, to go meet with officials from foreign governments to see if they can influence somehow the upcoming presidential election. We've had enough of that, and Rudy Giuliani should just back off, Senator Elizabeth Warren said in West Virginia, according to CNN. Warren wasn't alone among the Democrats running for president in 2020 to defend Biden. In New Hampshire, Robert O'Rourke, said that Giuliani's proposed trip to Ukraine was so very troubling, very disappointing, and yet not a total surprise given this president's behavior and the pattern that he had already set. Now, I don't take Warren's defense of Biden at face value. I think Warren's defense is actually a calculated move to gain press coverage for her and to win over Biden voters and backers if he begins to falter. Now, in a really bizarre twist, Rudy Giuliani, seeking info in Ukraine about Biden's doings in Ukraine, was spun as seeking foreign assistance to interfere in the next election. Will Ukraine have legs as a campaign issue? Lots of people in the media and politicians are talking about it. And in fact, on the Laura Ingraham show, Peter Schweitzer, the author of many books about the Clintons, had this to say.
Yeah, look, from the beginning, when the book came out, and even today with the New York Times confirming my reporting, what the leftists basically do is attacking me personally and now attacking the New York Times. They're not disputing any of the facts. And the facts are simple, Laura, and that is that Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, got on the payroll of a very corrupt Ukrainian energy company called Burisma in the spring of 2014, where he was paid about $50,000 a month to do, quote unquote, regulatory compliance for this company. He now admits to the New York Times that's not really what he did. He doesn't describe any work that he did. And the problem, of course, is Hunter Biden had no background in Ukraine, no background in energy. What he did have was a father who was vice president of the United States, who is responsible for all aid flow of Western dollars going to Ukraine. And Joe Biden made decisions about when to look the other way when money disappeared, as it did with Privat Bank, and in other instances when it did. And it's just a pattern, Laura. We talked about it on your show before as it relates to China. The Biden family has cashed in while Joe Biden was vice president, and they're not refuting any of the facts. They're simply attacking me, and in this case, the New York Times. When right before Donald Trump was being sworn in the United States, where was Joe Biden in all places of the world? He was in Ukraine. Very, very unusual for a sitting vice president to spend his last few days in a foreign country that far away. We need to learn more about this. I've said before the Senate needs to have Hunter Biden come and testify and explain the $1.5 billion private equity deal he got from the Chinese government flying over on Air Force Two with his dad. And he needs to explain this deal with the Ukrainians that makes absolutely no sense.
Amen. And I think the other reason they need to have him come in is if there was a quid pro quo that Hunter Biden and that Joe Biden went over and said, you cannot get these loan guarantees, you cannot get this foreign aid unless you fire a prosecutor who happened to be investigating the gas company that Hunter Biden sat on, that's the kind of collusion that Democrats really ought to be concerned about. Now, I don't know, maybe these are just wild conspiracy theories, connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But, Democrats can really, they can't complain about that, having spent almost 3 years on a false Russian collusion conspiracy theory. Now, just like with the Trump collusion conspiracy theory, these falsehoods can linger and cause damage to a politician, even if untrue or overblown, which is why I think there ought to be hearings and people ought to find out the truth of what's going on. If we start hearing protests that people are picking on Biden's family, that's a tell. Remember, the people protesting coverage of Biden's family conflicts are exactly the same people who relentlessly attack Trump's adult children. Now back to Hillary Clinton first. I want to tie a little of this back to Hillary Clinton. In the case of Hillary, there was a lot of truth to accusations of her malfeasance as to emails and her email server. But in order for the Biden-Ukraine and Biden-China controversy to rise to the level of Hillary's emails, there's going to have to be a there. And if there is a there is where you can expect Trump and the Republicans to go. And if they go there, and there is actually something there, can I say there that many more times? But if there is something there, and the Republicans in the 2020 election, assuming that Biden's the nominee, and they go there, we may see a repeat of 2016. Biden will be dogged by these allegations, just as he was dogged by allegations of plagiarism when he ran back in 1988, I think that it was. Every time that Biden seems to want to run for president, all of these kinds of things start to percolate to the surface. Will it again in this cycle? Seems to me it already is percolating. The funny thing about the whole Biden story is that it's a great example of how the ruling elite, people think that the rules that you and I have to abide by don't apply to them. Well, sometimes rules are just for regular people. Rules are just for you. If you're a person of politically preferred pigmentation, then you're immune from the rules. Those who don't understand this are going to have to be re-educated by the liberal establishment on behalf of the leftist mob that drags it along by the nose. And I've got proof. You want the proof? Just ask Natasha Tynes. She may have actually lost a book deal after she reported a D.C. subway employee for eating on a train. Now, if you've never been on the Washington metro system, there are signs everywhere. No drinking, no eating, no smoking, no loud music. If you're going to be listening to your iPhone, you need to have earbuds in. They do that because they want to create an atmosphere, particularly in the middle of August when it's hot, steamy, and a miserable thing to be on. They want to create an atmosphere that is safe and is amenable to all of the tourists and all of the workers that use the Washington metro system. But confronting the employee herself, which is what this woman did, it's an employee of the subway system, of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, the WMATA. I never can get that straight. So this woman, Natasha Tynes, confronts this employee because she's eating on the subway. And of course, when she did, she got responses by those on the subway like, worry about yourself. So what did Natasha Tynes do? She made the report, even though the employee is black. Now, it's a minor complaint, but there are actually reasons for the rule against eating on the train. It makes it easier to keep the rats under control. Now, if there's a rule, it should be applied to blacks, just like it should be applied to whites or Asians or to handicapped people or to anybody else. Regardless, maybe it should apply regardless of what your pronoun is. If there is a rule, it should apply to blacks too, no matter how oppressed this particular black person thinks that she may be. But that's not how the liberal mob views things. Listen to this story. Jordanian American journalist and writer Natasha Tynes faced Twitter wrath after she alerted the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority to a black woman in a metro uniform eating on a train, presumably on her way to work. Tynes, who has since deleted her tweet, reportedly wrote, quote, "I thought we were not allowed to eat on the train. This is unacceptable. Hope that at WMATA responds." Oh, Twitter blew up. Can you imagine? Now, she's a Jordanian American. She's reporting that there's a black woman in a WMATA Transit Authority uniform eating on the train in violation of the rules. A minor violation, but there's a reason for the rule. Twitter explodes. Twitter erupted with outraged posts accusing Tynes of being a snitch. The backlash on Twitter mostly focused on the race and gender of the employee, with many calling out this journalist for contributing to the oppression of women of color, which I find deeply ironic, considering that Tynes, the woman who made the report about the black woman eating on the train in violation of the rules, is a woman of color herself. Now, can you imagine if a white woman did this? Now, with typical, dumbassery, these people screeched about the gluttonous rule breaker that she was being oppressed for, are you ready? For eating while black. Yeah, I guess, driving while black, and I guess now eating while black. Now, oppressors are to be destroyed by the liberal mob, and this includes Tynes, even though she's a person of color too. Not content with admonishing the author on Twitter, many flocked to the Goodreads page of her upcoming book, They Called Me Wyatt. They plastered that page with nasty comments denouncing her as a racist. Now, she issued the standard stupid apology, but why bother? The liberal mob will not accept apologies. As always, those in charge stepped in to do the mob's bidding. Rare Birds, the publishing house that was supposed to distribute Tynes' novel, said it considers the author's behavior horrible and has no desire to be involved with anyone who thinks that it's acceptable to jeopardize a person's safety and employment in this way. Are you freaking kidding me? Reporting a woman of color, a Jordanian American, reporting another woman of color who is violating the rules of her own company while on the subway, and then the mob goes after this person of color who made the report on her or to her publisher, and the publisher does the bidding of the mob. You know, if anybody's safety was jeopardized, it was Tynes, the author who made the report. When you think about it, this blame the victim double talk is quintessentially vindictive liberalism. Now, we recently had to wade through the same BS when the Chicago Cubs banned one of their fans as a sacrificial offering to political correctness. I was going to do this story last week, and I never got to it. But while ESPN or some sports station, I don't know whoever's covering the Cubs, was reporting from the stadium, reporting from the stands, somebody, you know, when they photobomb a TV reporter, gave a peace sign and what appeared to be an okay sign. In a statement on Friday, her publisher, California Cold Blood, said it was discussing appropriate next steps with their distributor. With the backlash showing no signs of waning on Saturday, the company announced that it was halting all shipments from the warehouse and postponing the book's publication date while working on the next steps to officially cancel the book's publication. You should be afraid. You should be very, very afraid. Now, that rule is there for a reason. That rule is there because if you eat on the train, I don't care how OCD you are, you're going to drop crumbs. And when the trains are stopped or parked, it's going to attract the rats. You don't want rats on the subway, or at least I don't think you do. Lewis Black had this to say about rats on the subway.
Good news is that crime is down in New York, but the bad news is that segregation is up.
A new study suggests there's a genetic divide between uptown rats and downtown rats.
The rats that live in uptown north of 59th Street are distinct from those living in downtown south of 14th Street. They tend to stick to those neighborhoods.
Well, of course downtown rats don't want to hang out with those snooty uptown rats eating their imported cheese and doing their rat soul cycle. But don't tell me uptown rats never go downtown. Where else do they get their weed? But even with 2 million rats, there's something even worse underground in New York City: the subway.
Endless days of delays for strap hangers as our subway system seems to be disintegrating.
Subway delays have surged nearly 300% in 5 years.
New York is the most frequently delayed subway system in the world. The only system that comes anywhere close in terms of delays is Mexico City, and even that is 71% on time versus 65% on time for New York.
Mexican trains are faster? Thank God! I may be late for my prostate exam here, but at least I'll be on time for my unlicensed scrotal rejuvenation there. I'm doing it for me, so I feel more self-confident.
I'm doing it for me. Rats on subways. Think about that. Someone is eating on a subway, you report it to the authorities, and you lose a book deal. If you don't think the liberal mob exists, and if you don't think the liberal mob eats its own, Natasha Tynes, don't forget that woman's name. All she did was make a report about an employee violating her own employer's rules about eating on the subway. And while we can laugh about rats in uptown or downtown New York City, the rats in Washington, D.C. are monsters, and they'll cost you a job. Sometimes I think the rats and the liberal mob are one and the same. And you know, speaking of rats and thugs, I mean, kind of the same thing, right? Let's do a couple of taxpayer relief shots. The first one comes to us from Lancaster, California.
And caught on Ring home video, a red-haired, bearded man trying to enter homes. Then, after entering this home, just minutes later, he was dead.
He just casually walked up to the door, attempted to turn the knob. It didn't work. He walked to the window, tried to slide it open. It didn't open. He turned around and left.
Shortly before 7 o'clock Mother's Day morning, this man is caught on home surveillance video going door to door at homes of residents who don't want to go on camera in the 45,100 block of Loma Vista Drive in Lancaster. Just minutes later, sheriff deputies say he actually entered this home and never exited.
I believe the wife had called the station to report that somebody was trying to break into their house, and while they were on the phone with the sheriff's station, the male suspect had entered the house, went up the stairs, and had entered their bedroom.
The husband, fearing for his and his family's life, fatally shot the suspect in the upper torso. Sheriff deputies arrived and found the suspect in the upstairs bedroom, deceased with a gunshot wound to the upper torso.
The guy started trying to break into the very corner house down there, and then he went to the next house, and then the next one, and there's a dog in the backyard. And that's why I figure he come across the street and didn't bother our house, because ours is the next one in line.
While the death investigation is ongoing, detectives say the family's home security system allowed them to brace themselves and will corroborate the uninjured family's story. Meanwhile, uneasy residents support their neighbor.
They're a very nice family.
And you say, had that been you?
It'd been me. I'd have shot him too.
Unfortunately, he's no longer living as a result of his actions.
That slender-billed, bearded, red-haired man has not been identified. As the investigation continues, the homeowners have left until the crime scene has been cleaned.
How many times have I described when talking about taxpayer relief shots? And for those of you that have never heard a taxpayer relief shot, we are not celebrating the death of this individual. We are celebrating the fact that in this country, you can still defend yourself. You can defend your property. You can defend your home. You can defend your family. That's regardless of the Second Amendment. It's about natural rights. It's about God-given rights. But I was struck by this comment because this comment in the story sums up everything you need to know about a taxpayer relief shot.
Unfortunately, he's no longer living as a result of his actions.
Oh, unfortunately, he's no longer alive as a result of his actions. Wow. Somebody nailed it on the head right there. Thug goes from house to house. A dog scares him away from one house. Lights scare him away from another house. He finally finds a house that he's going to break into. And when he breaks into it, the alarm alerts the family. They escape to their bedroom, get in a defensive posture, and he ends up dead right there. That's a taxpayer relief shot. The second one comes to us from Phoenix, where some dirtbag decides that he wants to rob a restaurant.
An armed robbery at a Phoenix restaurant ends with a suspect shot and killed.
Tonight, employees of that restaurant are talking to us about what was a terrifying experience.
Andrew Hasman joins us live at the restaurant with the story tonight. Andrew.
And John, the employees here did not see the shooting. That's because they were so scared, they ran and hid in the bathroom. All police will tell us about the man who shot the armed robber is that he's associated with this restaurant.
An armed robber. I want you to keep in mind that this particular robber was armed because while I believe that this is a valid taxpayer relief shot, in other words, the person who ends up shooting this thug was in his lawful rights doing so, the way it's described in the story leads a little bit to wonder, which I'll explain in just a second.
Tacos Mish at 27th Avenue in Camelback had about 8 customers inside eating when a man walked in with a gun.
A person came in. He pointed a gun at me and told me to open the register and give him money. He was very mad.
At first, the employee says she didn't give up the money, but the suspect wouldn't take no for an answer. Workers say he grabbed the money out of the register and took off. Soon after, gunshots rang out in the parking lot.
When I heard the gunshots, I ran to the bathroom to hide.
Phoenix police say a man associated with the restaurant admitted to shooting 35-year-old Cesar Garcia Bermudez. He was found dead near the business. Employees tell us they had seen the suspect in the restaurant before, and the restaurant, they say, was recently robbed.
I was scared because this is the second time it's happened, and the last time was on Sunday.
Police questioned the shooter and released him. At this point, he's not facing any charges, but the investigation is ongoing. And police tell us there were many witnesses who left the scene after the shooting. Investigators now want to speak with those witnesses, and they are asking them to come forward.
Here's why I think we ought to talk about this particular taxpayer relief shot. He robs the restaurant, threatens the employees with their lives, so they have a reasonable fear for their lives. The robber, the thug, takes the money from the register, flees the restaurant with a gun in his hand. Now, we don't know whether there was a confrontation, meaning that the other employee who was armed ran into the robber as he left. That's one scenario. And if he shot him under that scenario, that would be a legitimate taxpayer relief shot. Defending yourself, reasonable fear of life. Let's change the facts up just a little bit because the report is unclear. Let's say the robber has now robbed the restaurant, taken the money, leaves the restaurant, is running out with the gun and the money in his hands, and the other employee starts to chase the robber. Now, if all that occurs is the robber continues to run away, never turns, never points his weapon at the other employee who's trying to get the restaurant's money back, and that employee shoots the robber, investigators and witnesses may decide that that was not a justified homicide because that individual did not fear for his life because the robber never turned and pointed the gun, which leads to the third scenario I want you to think about. Robber in the restaurant takes the money, runs out of the restaurant with the gun and the money in his hands. The other employee, who has his own gun, starts to chase. The robber turns, confronts, or points his weapon at the restaurant employee. The restaurant employee at that point, in my opinion, has a reasonable fear for his life and is justified in shooting. You see how easily taxpayer relief shots can turn depending upon the facts? Now, I think this one is a classic, and I think the employee will be exonerated. The employee will be found to have done a justifiable homicide, defending himself and the restaurant. I don't know whether he owns or works at the restaurant. That's kind of immaterial to me. But I think any time that you have the employees who feared for their lives with an armed robber, and you confront that robber in the parking lot that you know has now robbed your restaurant, I think regardless of whether he brandishes his weapon or not, I think it's a clear and justified taxpayer relief shot. But I point it out because I simply want you to think about if you ever have to use your weapon. That's why I've always encouraged you to sign up with one of these organizations that provides legal defense if you ever have to fire your weapon. You ever have to brandish your weapon. You need insurance because there's no guarantees that the cops or other witnesses or even the prosecutor are going to see it the way you did. Be prepared to defend yourself in court. That's a great lesson from today's taxpayer relief shot. So speaking of taxpayer relief shots, as detailed from CBS News, this is a list of the 5 deadliest cities in the United States and their homicide rate per 100,000 residents. Now, as a reference point, the homicide rate for the entire United States averages 4.6 per 100,000 citizens. That's according to the FBI Uniform Crime Report for 2017. So here are the top 5. Cleveland at 33.7 per 100,000, Detroit at 39.7 per 100,000, New Orleans at 40.6 per 100,000, Baltimore at 51.1 per 100,000, and coming in at number 1 on our list of the deadliest cities in the United States, St. Louis, with 64.9 per 100,000. That is 14 times more deadly than the average in the entire United States. But I have a question. What do all these cities have in common? Every one of these cities has more than 20 years of Democrat rule, mayor and city council majorities. But you might ask, why did Chicago, with a murder rate of only 24 per 100,000, not make the top 10? It's a simple answer. If you look at the murder map of Chicago, you'll find that the vast majority of murders in Chicago occur on the city's south and west sides, and very few occur in the heavily populated downtown area or Cook County. So what, you say? You know, there's an old saying that the average American has one breast and one testicle, but good luck trying to find one. What the statistics mean to the residents of the city of Chicago is that if you live in one of the affluent areas of Chicago, you are relatively safe, but if you live in any of the southern or western districts, you're probably living in one of the most dangerous places in the United States. A great lesson on statistics and a great lesson on what Democrat politics mean for the average American. Speaking of Democrat politics, Talking Point USA came out with a montage. They talked to expats of Venezuela, people who had escaped socialism, who had escaped Maduro, who had escaped Chavez, and are now living elsewhere. And they asked, Talking Point USA, asked these individuals, what would you say to Americans, particularly those who say we ought to be on this path towards socialism? Listen to people who have actually lived under a socialist regime.
Let me tell you something, Alexandria. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I want to tell you something. El socialismo no funciona. El socialismo no funciona. My name is Jose. I'm 21 years old. I am Samuel Machado. I'm 22 years old. I fled real socialism. Me and my family fled real socialism. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Alexia Ocasio-Cortez. You're a liar. You are a liar. You don't know what you're talking about. You're clueless. You have never gone through socialism, so you preach it like you do. America will never be a socialist country. America will never be a socialist country. A lot of people think socialism, it's all about equality and free stuff. What socialism is really about, it's starvation. People dying from lack of medicine. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I want to tell you something. If you really believe in socialism, why are you here in the US? Why don't you move to Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, Afghanistan, China? Why don't you just go there? You know, you talk about socialism as it is something so perfect, but you know it's not. Oh no, actually, you really truly believe that it works like that, but it doesn't. Just go and look at the actual facts and not just the books. Isn't it good to have your life going every day to Starbucks, tweeting how much you hate capitalism from your MacBook? That's great, right? We cannot even tweet. If we tweet something we don't like in Venezuela, the government is actually going after us. And let me tell you, I don't want the US being socialist. Why? Because my mom was almost killed by the socialist government because she was reporting all the human rights violations. Guys with guns went to my house, put a gun on my head and my little brother's head. Just for that, she almost got killed and all my family with it. I don't want the US to be socialist. My grandfather had leukemia. We had to go to the other side of the border, to Colombia, to get our medicine. Single-payer healthcare systems don't work. If you're gonna wait for the government to pay up for your surgeries, you're gonna die waiting on a bed. The US, you're free, you can see whatever you want, and nobody's going to attack you for it. I am so happy for being here because now I'm safe, and I feel free, and I feel protected because we are in a free society. Back in 2007, the government blackmailed my family over a land that was, by law, ours. We actually had to pay them off a huge amount of money just for them not to take it away from us. And it was actually ours, so I don't want that in America, ever. I've noticed in America, newest politicians such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez preaching socialism and how good it is for society. Let me tell you something, Alexandria. You're a liar. You have never been through socialism in your life for you to be preaching it the way you're doing it. El socialismo no funciona.
El socialismo no funciona.
Boom. I think all the socialists in America just got their hats handed to them. Who better to teach us, who better to learn from than those who have actually lived under these authoritarian regimes? And do not mistake that socialism is an authoritarian regime. You know, one of the tenets of socialism is that we need to come up with all these renewable energy sources. And I don't mind doing that in the private sector. I don't mind if the free markets come up with renewables in such a fashion that they are profitable and that they're actually working. But once again, just like we can look to Venezuela for the dangers of socialism, we can look to Sweden and what happens when you demand that there be zero carbon electricity. This story, reported back on May 3rd, says, global trade wars and weakening export markets are not the only potential dampers on Sweden's growth. There's also a homegrown problem, a lack of power capacity. The dire situation stems from the closing of the nation's oldest reactors and a shift to wind at a time when the grid is already struggling to keep up with demand in major cities. The shortage, which impacts the nation's main urban areas, is threatening everything from the rollout of a 5G network in the capital to investments in giant data halls and new subway lines. It could even derail Stockholm's bid for the 2026 Winter Olympics. It's a stark change from the decades of cheap surplus electricity that propelled the Nordic region's biggest economy into one of the richest and most industrialized nations in the world. Now, electricity supplies in urban areas can't keep up, and that could exacerbate a slowdown already impacted by global uncertainty and Brexit. Jonas Kamlet, a strategist for the city of Malmö, the nation's third biggest, said, citizens and companies are worried, irritated, and even angry. How could this situation arise in the engineering nation of Sweden? Well, I got the answer for you. This situation occurs because of this ambitious green agenda that you embarked upon. Sweden, nobody ever wants to, socialists never want to talk about this. But Sweden is halfway through a plan to replace the output from 4 reactors in the industrial south with thousands of wind turbines in the north. But the grid connections, some dating back to the 1950s, aren't up to scratch, so the power isn't shipped to where it's really needed. And to make matters even worse, the city demand is surging at a faster than expected pace because of the electrification of everything from transport to heating, which is a nice footnote to remember that every time somebody tells you that, oh, I'm driving a Prius to save the environment, ask them, where does your electricity come from? Where did the power come from to manufacture your Tesla? Where does that power come from? When you tell me that you're driving it simply because you want to save money on gas, I'll accept that. But don't give me the hocus pocus mumbo jumbo that you're doing it because you want to save the environment. Sweden is collapsing because they can't get enough power because they're shutting down reactors in exchange for windmills. Your Honor, I rest my case. But speaking of technology, it really is kind of interesting to think about how far technology has come. There are some tech products that are made so well that not even dropping them down the stairs or swallowing them is going to stop them from working. In fact, I've got a pair right here. Let me reach over and grab them. So I'm going to pull them out. You know what they are? AirPods. A man from Taiwan received the surprise of his life after pooping an AirPod that he had swallowed only to find that it still worked. Ben Hsu reportedly fell asleep while wearing his Apple AirPods, as we all tend to do, and he found that he was missing a headphone when he woke up. So he used the special, those of you who are Mac users know that you can go onto your Find My iPhone. It's a tracking device that lets you track all of your Apple devices so that you can see where they are. I actually left, I'll confess to this, I actually left an iPad on top of my car one day. Forgot about it, drove off. And when I made a turn, it went flying off. I realized it about halfway to work. What did I do? Went on my phone, tracked my iPhone, tracked my iPad, found where it was located, went to a residential construction site. There are all these workers. They're up on the roof. They're everywhere. They're working like crazy. And I find a guy that appears to be in charge, and I said, I'm here to pick up my iPad. And he looks at me like, we don't know what you're talking about. Nobody here has your iPad. And I pulled out my phone, and I showed him exactly where the iPad was. And it appeared to be in a truck parked outside the residence. So the guy yells at his workers, yells at them in Spanish. Some kid comes sheepishly walking down the steps, over to the truck, opens the door, hands me my iPad. Now, I've never swallowed my AirPods, but apparently Ben Hsu did. He kept hearing the beeping sound, but he couldn't figure out where it was. And later he realized that the sound was coming from inside his stomach. Can you imagine how freaked out this guy was? The headphone was inside his gut, just in there chilling, just in there beeping away. Medics at the municipal hospital confirmed the AirPod was indeed inside his stomach with an x-ray, showing he was in the process of passing it through his digestive system. Now, not wanting to get surgery, they told him the best option was just to go home, have a light dinner, and poop out the pod. Oh, they gave him a laxative too, to make things a bit easier. Go home and poop out the pod. Thanks for listening to the Michael Brown Unplugged. You can find me by going to the website, michaelbrowntoday.com, michaelbrowntoday.com, and you'll see there where you can download or live stream this podcast. And you'll also find across the bottom all of my social media platforms. You can subscribe to YouTube. You can like the Facebook page. You can ask to follow me on LinkedIn. You can follow me on Instagram. All of those icons are at the bottom of the website, michaelbrowntoday.com. And you can also listen to the podcast, Michael Brown Unplugged, right there. So do me a favor. Go to michaelbrowntoday.com. Click on the icons for all of the social media sites and follow me. Hint, hint. On the Facebook page, we now have a discussion group inside the page. So go to facebook.com/Michael D. Brown. You'll find there the discussion group, and you can ask to be a member. Yeah, we're not letting the trolls in. We're just letting real people in that want to have serious discussions. So you can do that again by going to michaelbrowntoday.com and clicking on the Facebook link. And then click on the others, follow me on the social media platforms, and then one last favor I have to ask. Please share this podcast with your friends and family. I want to keep the numbers growing. They're doing well, and I appreciate everybody that listens to it, and we'll talk again tomorrow. Take care.